The myth of German invincibility during the early years of the Second World War was a narrative carefully constructed by Berlin, trumpeted by propaganda, and believed implicitly by the world. It was a myth of endless, overwhelming victory, symbolized by the roaring columns of the Panzer divisions and the precision of the Luftwaffe. Yet, long before the Allied army set foot on the beaches of Normandy, and years before the final, agonizing collapse beneath the rubble of Berlin, a different truth was already known, whispered in guarded tones far from the Führer's headquarters. This realization did not emerge from the ranks of disheartened infantry or skeptical civilians. It came from the very men who commanded the Wehrmacht's triumphs, Germany's most capable, most seasoned generals. They were the first to glimpse the abyss behind the victories, the professional soldiers whose cold, hard realism pierced the fog of Nazi ideology. Their insight was a slow, agonizing descent from confidence into dread and finally into grim certainty that the war could not be won. This grim certainty was not the product of a single climactic defeat, but the creeping realization that the very nature of the conflict, its scale, its resource requirements, and the fundamental underestimation of the enemy made eventual victory a mathematical impossibility. These generals continued to obey, they continued to fight, and they continued to command professional duty, but they did so with the knowledge that the end had been written, not in a desperate last stand, but in the reckless arrogance of the initial campaign plans. This documentary chronicles that internal collapse, tracing the fatal psychological journey of the Wehrmacht High Command from the glory of the 1940 Blitzkrieg to the fatalistic despair that gripped them long before the final surrender. It is a story not of guns and tanks, but of mathematics and morale, of the moment when professional military wisdom clashed disastrously with political delusion, and when the men who had tasted ultimate power realized they were utterly powerless to avert national annihilation. We will examine the exact points of failure, the logistical breaking points, the critical strategic errors, and the devastating enemy resilience that turned the generals' triumphs into a prelude for disaster, starting with the very moment Germany believed it stood at the pinnacle of its power. The early summer of 1941 represented the absolute peak, the true zenith, of the Wehrmacht's power and reputation. In less than 24 months, Hitler's Germany had engineered a military revolution, shattering the established global order and rewriting the very doctrines of modern warfare. The lightning campaigns against Poland and Norway, and most significantly, the stunning, rapid conquest of France and the Low Countries, had elevated the German High Command to an almost mythical status. Generals who had spent the interwar years stifled by the constraints of the Versailles Treaty, nursing professional resentments, and secretly developing radical new concepts of motorized warfare, finally felt fully vindicated. Their revolutionary approach, combining speed, decentralized command, and overwhelming surprise, known as Blitzkrieg, had not just defeated opponents, it had psychologically paralyzed them. The world watched in awe and terror as a formidable French army collapsed in mere weeks. This era was a time of immense professional pride and deep collective affirmation for the German officer corps. The very officers who would later contemplate treason were then basking in the glory of a strategy they had forged, believing themselves to be the inheritors of the great German military tradition, finally unconstrained and demonstrating their genius on a global stage. The speed and decisiveness of these victories led to a collective overconfidence that became a fatal psychological flaw. Having achieved the impossible in the West, many generals genuinely believed they were invincible and that no foe, certainly not the ideologically despised Soviet Union, could withstand their methods. The belief was not merely propaganda. It was a deeply internalized professional conviction fueled by unbroken success. This atmosphere of triumph set the stage for the next great gamble. When the planning for Operation Barbarossa began, it was conceived not just as a campaign, but as a final, inevitable culmination of German military destiny, the destruction of Bolshevism and securing a vast new territory for the Third Reich in a single, decisive stroke. The psychological environment was one of absolute belief in their superiority, superior doctrine, superior soldiers, and superior leadership. This supreme self-assurance, however, contained the dangerous seeds of underestimation and strategic overreach. The professional satisfaction of their genius blinded many to the simple, hard lessons of geography and logistics, lessons that older veterans of the Eastern Front in World War I had long tried to impart. This zenith of power was, in reality, a point of fatal arrogance that immediately preceded the beginning of the end. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the immense invasion of the Soviet Union, was launched, and initially, it delivered everything the generals had promised. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, achieving a level of penetration and destruction unseen in military history. The columns of panzers, spearheaded by men like Heinz Guderian, roar across the vast, open plains, advancing hundreds of kilometers within weeks. The Red Army appeared to be dissolving before their eyes. Massive encirclement battles at Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev yielded prisoner hauls that defied imagination, often tallying hundreds of thousands in single pockets. By the late summer and early autumn, the generals were riding a wave of seemingly terminal success. Officers, reading the daily reports of captured territory and enemy losses, genuinely believed they were witnessing fulfillment of Hitler's prophecy, the destruction of the Soviet Union, in a single, short campaign. It was an astonishing display of military effectiveness, solidifying professional conviction that blitzkrieg was the final word in warfare. Yet, beneath this veneer of absolute triumph, the seeds of doubt were already being sown, specifically among the high-ranking operational officers responsible for translating the ambitious strategic plan into logistical reality. These seeds were rooted not in fear of the enemy, but in the cold, hard mathematics of the campaign itself. The front was simply too wide, a 1,000-mile expanse that demanded an impossible distribution of limited forces. Guderian's famous Panzerspitzen, armored spearheads, were racing far ahead of the crucial infantry divisions and, most critically, ahead of their own supply convoys. The sheer speed of the advance, the very essence of the blitzkrieg philosophy, became a crippling logistical liability. Motorized divisions, the spearhead of the Wehrmacht, were frequently immobilized for days for lack of fuel, waiting desperately for overworked and vulnerable supply lines to catch up across the primitive, dusty roads of the interior. The vast distances devoured fuel and equipment at an unsustainable rate. Some veteran officers, haunted by the ghosts of the First World War's Eastern Front, recognized the dangerous familiarity of the situation, a deep advance into an endless enemy interior, trading manageable lines of communication for unsustainable territorial gain. Despite these professional warnings echoing up the chain of command, Berlin, fueled by delusion, continued to demand faster and deeper penetration. The immediate tactical victory obscured the burgeoning strategic nightmare. The first whispers of unease focused on logistics. How we sustained this? That professional unease was the first crack in the facade of invincibility, transforming the operational triumph into a strategic ticking clock. As the Wehrmacht pushed relentlessly deeper into the Soviet interior during the late summer and early autumn of 1941, the logistical nightmare that had been merely an unease among the generals quickly hardened into a professional dread. The campaign transformed from a series of tactical maneuvers into a brutal, grinding conflict against two intractable foes: vastness and logistics. The operational generals, the men whose careers were based on precise calculations of supply rates, fuel consumption, and marching distances, were the first to understand that the war was being lost not on the battlefield, but on the supply map. The front line stretched for thousands of kilometers, swallowing up entire army groups and demanding a continuous flow of fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement parts across lines that were far too long, too fragile, and too vulnerable to partisan attack. The essence of the problem lay in the structural differences between the German and Soviet military infrastructure. The German army relied heavily on motorized transport and standard-gauge rail lines for deep penetration, but the Soviet rail system operated on a different gauge. This necessitated vast, painstaking efforts to convert thousands of kilometers of rail lines behind the rapidly advancing front, creating an insurmountable bottleneck. Divisions were racing forward, leaving behind a logistical vacuum. Heinz-Guderian's armored divisions, for instance, would often outrun their fuel supply, forcing them to stop and wait, sacrificing the very speed that was their defining advantage. The infantry divisions, which were mostly marching on foot, often lagged days behind the tanks, turning the synchronized blitzkrieg into a ragged, disjointed advance. Furthermore, the scale of the captured territory was deceptive. Every mile gained required tens of thousands of men to secure supply lines and guard rear areas against the tenacious, unforgiving Soviet partisans. This drain on manpower was unsustainable, eating into the reserves that were supposed to be used for the final decisive blow. The most chilling realization for the older generals, especially those who had fought on the Eastern Front in the First World War, was the unmistakable presence of the ghost of 1914. They recognized a pattern: trading space for time, advancing far beyond sustainable means, and underestimating the vastness of Russia, which historically swallowed invading armies whole. They saw the same grinding attrition and the same overstretched lines that had bled the Kaiser's army white decades earlier. The professional reports flooding into Berlin warned of crippling equipment breakdowns, unsustainable fuel consumption, and the growing, terrifying realization that the Red Army, despite losing millions of men in vast amounts of territory, had not collapsed. New Soviet divisions, seemingly materialized from the endless eastern interior, kept appearing, fresh and well-equipped. The general staff, forced to reconcile the spectacular frontline victories with the disastrous logistical charts, began to understand that they were not fighting a campaign destined for a rapid conclusion, but were already mired in a war of exhaustion against a foe whose capacity to absorb punishment and exploit geography had been fatally underestimated. The initial unease over logistics had crystallized into the first professional conviction that the war was fundamentally unwinnable due to a flawed initial strategic premise. November 1941 marked a critical psychological turning point for many of Hitler's generals, transforming their professional anxiety over logistics into an inescapable dread and igniting the first fatal doubts about the war's ultimate outcome: the drive toward Moscow, the perceived final prize that would shatter Soviet resistance, stalled abruptly. This halt was due not merely to the tenacious Soviet counterattacks, but to the sudden, brutal onset of the Russian winter, a foe that proved far more crippling than any Soviet division. The temperatures plunged rapidly, dropping far below freezing. German equipment, designed for the milder climate of Central and Western Europe, failed catastrophically. Lubricants froze, making tanks and vehicles impossible to start. Weapons jammed repeatedly, requiring soldiers to use fire and extreme measures to keep their rifles operational. Motorized divisions were immobilized, frozen solid on the Russian roads. Furthermore, the Wehrmacht had planned for a short summer campaign and lacked essential winter clothing. Troops, already exhausted from hundreds of kilometers of relentless marching and fighting, faced unimaginable suffering from frostbite, hypothermia, and widespread demoralization. The supply lines, already tenuous due to the vast distances and the rail gauge problem, completely broke down in the face of the snow and cold. Fuel and ammunition shipments were delayed or failed to arrive entirely. Against this backdrop of physical disintegration, the Red Army launched a massive, coordinated counterattack outside Moscow in early December. This offensive, spearheaded by fresh Siberian divisions equipped for the extreme cold, shattered the assumption that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. For the first time, the invincible Wehrmacht was thrown back, forced into a desperate, chaotic retreat and defensive posture. This moment was profoundly traumatic for the German High Command. The myth of German superiority was not just dented, it was demonstrably broken. The failure to take Moscow, combined with the catastrophic impact of the weather and the realization that the Soviets possessed deep, unspent reserves, was the first true shock of defeat. In field headquarters and frozen forward dugouts across the Eastern Front, the whispers began to circulate. Officers who had believed in a short, decisive, and glorious war now faced the bitter reality of the same grinding attrition and endless war materials that had characterized World War I, a fate they had sworn their new doctrines would avoid. They saw their reserves depleted, their equipment destroyed not by the enemy but by the climate, and their morale brittle. Many began to articulate the unspoken thought. The war was already unwinnable. They realized Germany was now mired in a vast war of exhaustion against a foe that had absorbed the Blitzkrieg's best punch and was now counterpunching with devastating effect. No professional soldier who endured the winter of 1941 could mistake the truth. The campaign had failed, and Germany was now fighting for survival against an enemy whose resilience had been underestimated in every conceivable way. The brutal and decisive campaign failure outside Moscow in the winter of 1941 cemented a terrifying realization among the Wehrmacht generals. They had fatally underestimated the Soviet foe in every conceivable aspect, condemning Germany to a long, grinding war of exhaustion that they were structurally incapable of winning. The initial planning for Operation Barbarossa was based on flawed intelligence and extreme ideological arrogance, assuming the Soviet regime was a rotten, unstable structure that would collapse instantly once its army was shattered. This ideological blind spot was the root of all subsequent strategic errors. Firstly, Germany fundamentally underestimated the depth of Soviet reserves. Hitler and his generals had assumed that the mass surrender of hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in the early encirclement battles meant the Red Army was nearing depletion. They were horrified to discover that the Soviet state could draw on new, fresh divisions from the eastern interior, from Siberia and the Asian republics, divisions that were well-equipped and, crucially, prepared for the extreme cold. This ability to continuously replenish manpower and equipment, a capacity far exceeding Germany's own, turned the Blitzkrieg into a futile exercise in exchanging territory for unsustainable losses. Secondly, they underestimated the Soviet industrial capacity. Despite losing massive industrial centers in the West, the Soviets successfully evacuated key factories and production facilities deep into the Ural Mountains, placing them out of reach of the German air and ground forces. By 1942, these relocated factories were churning out immense quantities of T-34 tanks, Katyusha rockets, and aircraft, often surpassing the German production rates. The generals, focused on short-term tactical success, were professionally blindsided by the strategic reality that Germany was now fighting a war of industrial output and material replacement, a war that their relatively smaller economy and fragmented industrial base could not win against the combined, continuous output of the Soviet Union and, increasingly, the supplies pouring in from the Western Allies. Thirdly, they underestimated the Red Army's capacity to learn. The massive losses of 1941 were not in vain. They served as a brutal, accelerated learning curve for Soviet commanders and troops. By 1942, the Red Army was demonstrating improved operational competence, better coordination of armor and infantry, and a ruthless tactical flexibility. They learned to exploit the German overextension, concentrate forces for devastating counterattacks, and effectively utilized the vast geography as a weapon. The German High Command, still clinging to the doctrine of superior maneuver warfare, failed to grasp that they were no longer fighting the disorganized, shock Red Army of June 1941, but hardened, learning, and rapidly improving foe. This combination of insurmountable reserves, superior industrial capacity, and a rapidly professionalizing enemy meant that every German victory was now a Pyrrhic one, consuming irreplaceable resources and manpower in a conflict that, mathematically, could only end in exhaustion and defeat for Germany. Despite the devastating failure outside Moscow, Hitler, driven by a desperate need to restore momentum and blinded by his own ideological fixation, demanded a renewed massive offensive in 1942. Case Blue. The generals, though hollowed out by the winter and riddled with professional doubts, were compelled to obey. This offensive, however, was fundamentally flawed in its strategic premise, turning it into a reckless gamble that further alienated the professional officer corps and ultimately risked catastrophe. Case Blue was centered on two primary, yet widely divergent, strategic objectives: capturing the crucial oil fields of the Caucasus, the lifeblood of the Soviet war machine, and securing the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, a key industrial and symbolic center. The plan's inherent recklessness lay in its demand to divide the army's strength across immense, parallel distances. As the Wehrmacht forces rolled southward, their operational strength was split into two primary armies, one driving toward the oil, the other toward Stalingrad. The division of forces violated one of the most fundamental tenets of military strategy, the concentration of effort. Many experienced generals immediately protested this fatally flawed logic. The distances involved were astronomical, placing an intolerable strain on the already shattered German logistics system. To split forces between two equally vital but geographically separate objectives meant that neither force would possess the overwhelming strength necessary to achieve a decisive breakthrough and hold the ground. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group South, was one of the most vocal critics. He warned Hitler vehemently that splitting forces between the Caucasus and the Volga was an act of extreme risk, warning specifically that the overextended flanks would invite a catastrophic Soviet counter-encirclement. Hitler, in his growing delusion, dismissed von Bock's professional caution as weakness and negativity. Von Bock, a veteran and highly respected commander, was relieved of command with the Führer's dismissive, angry retort, "You always see black clouds." This moment was a significant marker of the growing chasm between professional German officer corps, who saw the hard reality dictated by maps and logistics, and Hitler, whose strategy was increasingly dictated by ideological fantasy and personal will. As the panzers rolled south, the generals in the field knew the campaign's logic was fatally flawed. The campaign represented not a restoration of blitzkrieg mastery, but a desperate, reckless overextension that placed the Wehrmacht in the most vulnerable possible position, confirming professional soldiers' growing dread that strategic common sense had been completely abandoned by the regime. The stage was set for the ultimate catastrophe that would forever shatter the myth of German invincibility. The tragic career of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock serves as a stark, early lesson in the price exacted by Hitler for professional dissent and the dangerous chasm that had opened between the Wehrmacht High Command and the Nazi leadership. Von Bock, a veteran of World War I and one of the Wehrmacht's most successful field commanders during the Blitzkrieg phase, embodied the old Prussian military tradition of strict duty and professional realism. His fatal moment of truth arrived during the planning and execution of Case Blue in the summer of 1942. Von Bock was the operational commander who had to execute Hitler's ill-conceived strategy of dividing Army Group South into two separate axes, one racing for the Caucasus oil fields, the other for Stalingrad on the Volga. As a career professional, von Bock immediately recognized that the split-force doctrine was an act of extreme strategic recklessness. He saw, clearly and clinically on the map, that the immense distance, the untenable logistics, and the resulting exposed, thinly held flanks would create an irresistible opportunity for a Soviet counterstroke. His duty, as a field marshal responsible for the lives of hundreds of thousands of men and the fate of the entire Eastern Front, compelled him to speak out. Von Bock repeatedly and strongly protested Hitler's orders, arguing for the concentration of forces on a single, decisive objective, or at least a more cautious, sequential approach. He used professional arguments, citing the limits of supply and the need for a secured rear area. For Hitler, however, such professional caution was seen not as sound military advice, but as ideological weakness and a failure of will. The Führer's vision was absolute, fueled by a delusion that Soviet power was exhausted. When von Bock's protest became too insistent, Hitler acted decisively, not on strategic grounds, but on personal pique. He dismissed von Bock from command, replacing him with a general more willing to execute the reckless strategy without question. Hitler's summary dismissal, reportedly telling the field marshal that he always saw black clouds, sent a terrifying message throughout the entire German high command. Professional realism was now punishable. The ultimate price of disobedience was immediate removal and the end of one's career, even if the general was proven tragically right. The removal of von Bock was a critical point of no return. It confirmed to the remaining generals that the regime had placed political delusion above military competence. It taught them the dangerous lesson that their professional duty was no longer to advise on the most effective path to victory, but simply to execute impossible orders, regardless of the consequences. This event deepened the sense of dread and fatalism in the officer corps. They saw that the disaster von Bock warned about was not just possible, it was now inevitable, led by a commander-in-chief who had rejected the very competence that had brought Germany its initial victories. The catastrophe at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943 was not just a battle lost. It was a moment the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was irrevocably shattered, confirming the general's deepest fears that Hitler's strategic delusions would lead to complete annihilation. The battle for the city on the Volga River devolved into a brutal house-to-house, street-by-street nightmare, a grinding attrition war for which the Wehrmacht was ill-suited and poorly supplied. General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army became bogged down in urban fighting, sacrificing their mobility and armor advantage for the slow, bloody, and ultimately futile capture of a symbolic objective. The reports filtering back from the front lines painted a desperate, terrifying picture. The Soviets were not yielding. They were fighting with an unprecedented, ferocious tenacity, exploiting every ruin and every pile of rubble. The fighting became a vortex that consumed German manpower and resources at an unsustainable rate. Yet, the generals who had seen the warning signs, the stretched supply lines, the exposed flanks, and the vast, open steppes, could only watch in professional horror as the inevitable materialized. In November 1942, the Soviet counter-encirclement, Operation Uranus, struck with devastating precision. The attack focused on the overstretched, poorly protected Romanian and Hungarian units holding the flanks, precisely as Field Marshal von Bock had predicted. In a matter of days, the entire German Sixth Army, one of the finest fighting forces Germany had ever fielded, along with substantial elements of the 4th Panzer Army, was completely surrounded, trapped in a frozen, desolate pocket. The encirclement stunned Berlin, but it did not surprise the professional officers who had seen the mathematical certainty of the disaster. Inside the frozen cauldron, General Paulus, trapped and cut off, maintained radio contact with Hitler, desperately pleading for permission to attempt a breakout, while his forces still possessed some capacity to maneuver. That permission never came. Hitler, driven by hubris and the delusion that the Luftwaffe could supply the massive army by air, ordered the Sixth Army to hold its position to the last man. This was the most chilling violation of military logic possible, sacrificing an entire field army for a point of pride. The Sixth Army perished where it stood. The psychological effect of Stalingrad on the officer corps was devastating and permanent. For the first time, an entire German field army, nearly 300,000 men, was lost, not merely defeated or retreated, but completely destroyed. Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility and replaced it with a stark, terrifying certainty. Hitler was willing to sacrifice every soldier and the very future of the Wehrmacht for his ideological fantasies. The unspoken question spread like a contagion through the general staff. If this could happen to the finest army Germany ever fielded, what hope remained for the rest of them? The annihilation of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad transcended a mere military defeat. It was a profound psychological earthquake that fundamentally destroyed the faith of the German high command and replaced a myth of invincibility with a crippling sense of fatalism. Prior to Stalingrad, German generals had experienced setbacks, but never total, irrecoverable destruction on this scale. The core belief that German military genius could overcome any challenge, a belief fostered by the Blitzkrieg victories, was instantly vaporized by the freezing reality of the Russian winter and the devastating effectiveness of the Soviet counterstroke. The psychological impact was multi-layered and transformative for the officer corps. Firstly, it destroyed strategic trust in Hitler. The generals realized that the Fuhrer was no longer a military genius guided by intuition, but commander-in-chief whose strategic decisions were reckless, ideologically driven, and utterly disconnected from reality. His order to hold Stalingrad to the last man, sacrificing 300,000 professional soldiers for a political symbol, demonstrated a terrifying disregard for the lives of his troops and the future stability of the entire front. This betrayal of professional military ethics could not be forgiven or rationalized by the generals. Secondly, it introduced the terrifying concept of total defeat. Before Stalingrad, defeat was abstract, a tactical retreat, a loss of territory. After Stalingrad, defeat became concrete. The complete encirclement, the slow starvation, the eventual annihilation, and the massive, unrecoverable loss of men and equipment. Officers who had once scoffed at the idea of anything less than victory were now forced to confront defeat in its purest, most absolute form. This created a profound sense of anxiety and despair that permeated every subsequent staff meeting and operational plan. Thirdly, it triggered the search for the exit. The unspoken question of if this could happen to the Sixth Army, what hope remains, morphed into how do we stop this? The professional obligation to achieve victory was replaced by the moral imperative to avoid further annihilation. Stalingrad served as a catalyst that began the slow, tortuous process of radicalization for the generals who would later join the resistance. Men like Henning von Treschow and Claus von Stauffenberg were not merely idealists. They were professional soldiers who concluded that if Hitler was willing to destroy his finest army, he was certainly willing to destroy the entire nation. The failure at Stalingrad was the evidence that convinced them that the removal of Hitler was no longer treason, but the ultimate act of military duty and national salvation. The psychological wound inflicted by the annihilation of the Sixth Army ensured that for every German general, all subsequent combat was fought with the knowledge that the strategic turning point had passed, and the trajectory toward final defeat was now fixed. The spring of 1943 brought no genuine recovery for the Wehrmacht. It only offered the cruel illusion of one, a temporary respite fueled by desperate planning for a final, massive counteroffensive. The strategic reality following catastrophe at Stalingrad dictated a defensive posture, a shortening of the lines, and a massive effort to rebuild the shattered army. Instead, Hitler demanded a decisive, grand-scale operation at the Kursk salient, the massive bulge in the Soviet lines. This offensive, known as Operation Citadel, was intended to restore the strategic balance on the Eastern Front, crush the Soviet armies caught in the bulge, and reclaim the initiative lost during the disastrous winter campaign. For the German generals, Kursk became the last great gamble of the war, an operation they entered with profound, deep-seated professional skepticism. The doubts were rooted in a cold assessment of the changed nature of the war. Firstly, the element of surprise, the key ingredient to every successful German operation since 1939, was utterly lost. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Soviets were fully aware of the German plans and had spent months transforming the Kursk salient into the deepest, most formidable defensive system ever built. They had constructed multiple concentric rings of defenses, laced with mines, anti-tank ditches, and heavily fortified strongpoints. The German generals knew they would be attacking a massive fortress, not a vulnerable flank. Secondly, the timing was fatally compromised by Hitler's insistence on delaying the attack repeatedly to wait for the newest tank technology, the Panther and the Ferdinand tank destroyers, to arrive. These delays allowed the Soviets critical months to deepen their defenses, stockpile resources, and deploy vast reserves. The generals argued vehemently that the strategic cost of delay far outweighed the marginal benefit of a few hundred new tanks. The professional officer corps understood the mathematics. The Red Army was now equipped and prepared to fight a defensive battle of attrition, which perfectly favored their numerical superiority and industrial capacity. Attacking into this fortified wall would guarantee devastating German losses that could not be replaced. Generals like Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, though an advocate for a different kind of maneuver warfare, recognized that a direct frontal assault would be suicidal. Yet, Hitler dismissed these warnings as pessimism and demanded a complete commitment to the offensive. When Operation Citadel finally launched in July 1943, it resulted in the largest tank battle in history, a colossal clash that quickly confirmed the generals' worst fears. The Soviet defenses held firm, German armor was decimated by the prepared defenses, and the offensive collapsed. Kursk sealed the strategic outcome of the war. After this devastating failure, there would be no more major German victories on the Eastern Front, and the German generals would be forever condemned to fighting a grueling, hopeless retreating war. The professional soldiers' last hope for restoring the military initiative was extinguished, confirming the grim certainty that the war was irrevocably lost. The failure of Operation Citadel at Kursk was the undisputed strategic death blow to the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, marking the end of all German offensive capacity and condemning the generals to a long, grinding, retreating war. From the summer of 1943 onward, the generals' role shifted fundamentally. They were no longer strategists planning conquest, but professional custodians managing a catastrophic, inevitable decline. Their new duty was not to achieve victory, but to execute a professional, orderly retreat that minimized losses and prolonged the war just enough to perhaps achieve a political solution, a hope that was itself a form of self-delusion. The stark truth of the situation was evident not in Hitler's propaganda, but in the maps the generals meticulously studied in their headquarters. These maps told a story of relentless, inexorable pressure. They showed the Red Army advancing westward across a front that stretched thousands of kilometers, pushing the German lines back mile by mile, day after day. The strategic initiative had passed entirely and permanently to the Soviets, who now dictated the time, place, and scale of every major engagement. For a professional soldier trained in maneuver warfare and the philosophy of seeking decisive battles, this constant, necessary retreat was not only humiliating, but also profoundly demoralizing. They were forced to fight on ground chosen by the enemy, constantly giving up territory that Hitler had declared essential. The maps also screamed a terrifying logistical reality. Losses were no longer replaceable. The figures flowing from the replacement division showed a critical shortfall in trained manpower, armor, and aircraft. German industry, despite massive efforts, simply could not keep pace with the combined output of the Soviet Union and the burgeoning supply lines from the Western Allies. Every tank lost at Kursk, every experienced infantryman killed in withdrawal, represented a permanent degradation of the Wehrmacht's fighting strength. The generals realized that they were facing a foe with an inexhaustible reservoir of men and material, while they were bleeding dry. The officers who commanded these retreating armies, men who had once prided themselves on maneuver and precision, were now reduced to executing difficult, often suicidal, rear-guard actions to cover withdrawal of civilian refugees and the remnants of their own battered divisions. The quiet fatalism that had begun after Stalingrad now deepened into grim certainty. There would be no more major victories, only holding actions and temporary tactical successes against a foe that was systematically dismantling the German war machine. The generals had to contend not only with the enemy's advance, but also with Hitler's disastrous micromanagement, as he insisted on holding strategically worthless cities to the last man, further compounding the losses and hastening the inevitable destruction of the remaining German field armies. Reading the maps became an exercise in charting the nation's slow, agonizing collapse. By the end of 1943, the mood inside the professional officer corps had undergone a complete and irreversible transformation. The early arrogance of 1940 and the stubborn denial of 1942 had been completely purged, replaced by a pervasive, chilling sense of quiet fatalism. The war, they understood, was not just strategically lost. It was now a countdown to national destruction. This was not an emotional collapse, but a professional conclusion drawn from irrefutable facts and figures that Hitler refused to acknowledge. The military professionals were grounded in the reality of numbers and resources. They saw that German industry could no longer replace the devastating losses of manpower and material on the Eastern Front. They witnessed the Allied bombers, now virtually unopposed, ruling the skies over Germany, systematically dismantling the infrastructure and industrial capacity that was supposed to fuel the war effort. They tracked the decimation of the U-boat fleet in the Atlantic, which meant the vital supply lines from the United States to Britain and the Soviet Union could no longer be severed. The generals could read the maps and the production charts. They were no longer fighting for victory, but for survival, and the odds were zero. This fatalism manifested in two divergent, equally dangerous paths. For the vast majority, it meant embracing a stoic, cynical silence. They chose to maintain the facade of loyalty and duty, rationalizing their compliance as necessary to prevent a total collapse and preserve some semblance of order in the chaos. They continued to issue and obey orders, even impossible ones, telling themselves that perhaps a political miracle, a rift between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, might yet occur. This silence was born of fear. Fear of the Gestapo, fear of execution, and a deeply ingrained fear of violating the sacred oath of military obedience. They became masters of falsifying reports, subtly adjusting casualty figures and equipment statuses to mitigate the worst of Hitler's destructive commands. However, for a significant courageous minority, the grim certainty of defeat led to the most extreme act of conscience, contemplating the unthinkable. These were not merely disgruntled idealists. They were professional soldiers who, having calculated the mathematical inevitability of annihilation, concluded that Hitler was the singular factor preventing an armistice and ensuring Germany's total ruin. Men like General Ludwig Beck, Henning von Treschow, and Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg reasoned that to remove Hitler was not an act of treason, but a final, desperate act of military duty, the only means left to save the Wehrmacht and the German nation from being destroyed alongside the regime. By late 1943, the seeds of the July 20th plot were finding fertile ground within an officer core paralyzed by dread and consumed by a fatalistic certainty. The profound shift from silent fatalism to active conspiracy was the most radical and dangerous psychological transformation within the German officer corps. For men steeped in the Prussian traditions of absolute loyalty and duty, the contemplation of regicide, the planned assassination of the head of state, was the ultimate moral and professional trespass. Yet, the military professionals who became the core of the resistance were driven to this unthinkable act by the cold, professional certainty of defeat. They concluded that Hitler was no longer a leader. He was a catastrophe, actively guiding Germany toward annihilation. The resistance was not fueled primarily by disgust at Nazi crimes, although that played a role, especially as the atrocities on the Eastern Front became undeniable. It was fueled by military necessity. The generals and staff officers involved, men like Claus von Stauffenberg, Henning von Treschow, and Ludwig Beck, were highly capable, deeply conservative professional soldiers who had concluded that every day the war continued under Hitler's command guaranteed greater death, greater destruction, and a more total defeat. They viewed his erratic decision-making, his refusal to allow strategic retreat, and his insistence on holding worthless positions to the last man as the primary military impediment to an armistice with the West. The fundamental reasoning was stark. To kill Hitler was not treason. It was salvation. It was the only remaining way to stop the war, preserve the Wehrmacht structure, and negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies before the Soviet steamroller crushed Germany entirely. The generals reasoned that the only way to save the core of the German state and military was to eliminate the destructive element at the top. This required them to override centuries of training that emphasized strict, unquestioning obedience, and to accept the immense personal risk of involving themselves in what the regime would instantly classify as the highest form of treachery. The conspiracy had surfaced before, during the crises of Sudetenland and the Moscow failure, but by late 1943 and 1944, it found far broader adherents. The disastrous losses at Stalingrad and the certain failure at Kursk provided irrefutable evidence that Hitler was militarily incompetent and actively destructive. The Gestapo and the SS, however, were everywhere. The penalty for even private dissent was immediate execution. For the vast majority of the officer corps, the easier path remained silence, obedience, and the hope of a political miracle. But for the small, dedicated corps conspirators, the guilt of inaction in the face of certain national ruin outweighed the sacred vow of loyalty. Their decision to act sealed their own fate, but their motivations remain a powerful testament to the moral dilemma faced by professional soldiers trapped within an ideologically bankrupt regime. June 6, 1944, the day the Allied army stormed the beaches of Normandy, delivered the final, undeniable truth to Hitler's generals. The war was now irrevocably lost on two fronts, and the strategic collapse was total. Up to this point, The conflict in the West had been a relatively abstract affair for the Wehrmacht High Command, primarily fought by the Luftwaffe against Allied bombers and the U-boats against supply convoys. But D-Day brought the war directly home, creating a two-front military predicament that Germany, critically short of manpower, fuel, and air cover, had no capacity to solve. The Allied landings shattered the lingering hope among some generals that Hitler would be able to concentrate his remaining strength against the Soviet foe. Within days, it became chillingly clear that the beachheads could not be contained, let alone driven back into the sea. German forces were overstretched, hampered by severe fuel shortages that paralyzed their armored counterattacks, and rendered largely blind by the overwhelming air superiority of the Allied forces. The generals who had once prided themselves on maneuver warfare, the very principles that had won them France in 1940, were now reduced to executing static, desperate defensive battles dictated by the enemy's material strength. This strategic shock was compounded by the direct and disastrous micromanagement of Adolf Hitler. Field commanders in Normandy were constantly frustrated by Hitler's refusal to release vital panzer reserves held back for fear of a secondary, phantom landing elsewhere. This hesitation violated the basic principle of responding to the main threat with maximum force. Generals were forced to conduct suicidal maneuvers or defend impossible positions based on orders dictated from a map room hundreds of kilometers away. Orders that were hours or days out of date and completely divorced from reality on the ground. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, was one of the first and most prominent generals to see the situation with brutal clarity. Touring the front lines, witnessing the devastation wrought by Allied air power, and recognizing the enemy's inexhaustible material superiority, Rommel confided his staff that the war was hopeless. He bluntly stated that the enemy's material superiority is overwhelming, and every day we prolong this war is a crime. Rommel, driven by this devastating realization, quietly began urging Hitler and his high command to negotiate a peace with the Western Allies, believing this was the only way to prevent Germany from being overrun entirely by the Soviets. His professional assessment, however, met only with Hitler's fury and immediate rejection. D-Day was a military execution notice for the Wehrmacht, and it cemented the final, despairing realization among the generals that the end was not a matter of if, but when. The tragedy of the German officer corps in 1944 is perhaps best personified by the fates of Field Marshals Erwin Rommel and Gunther von Kluge, two highly capable professional soldiers who found themselves utterly trapped between their professional duty to the nation and the destructive reality of a regime they knew was leading Germany to annihilation. Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox commanding Army Group B in Normandy, quickly became a most vocal and clear-sighted exponent of the belief that the war was lost after D-Day. Rommel's conclusion was based on direct, undeniable observation. The enemy's air superiority, the overwhelming logistical capacity, and the sheer volume of material meant that the Western Front was militarily untenable. He was a professional who believed in swift, decisive action, but he was forced to fight a static, unwinnable defense. His subsequent efforts to convince Hitler to seek peace with the Western Allies, an attempt to save the German nation from total ruin, led to his quiet implication in the failed July 20th assassination plot. Faced with a choice between a humiliating public trial for treason and subsequent execution, which would destroy his family's honor, and quiet suicide, Rommel chose the latter, taking his own life by poison in October 1944. His death was a devastating blow to the morale of the officer corps, a symbol of the ultimate cost of professional honesty under the Nazi regime. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who temporarily commanded the entire Western Front after Rommel was wounded, suffered a similar, agonizing fate. Kluge was a complex, conflicted figure, conservative, loyal, and deeply ambivalent about joining the resistance. He was aware of the July 20th plot, and was viewed by the conspirators as a potential figurehead for a post-Hitler military government. However, his paralyzing indecision and lingering sense of loyalty prevented him from taking decisive action on the day of the bombing. When the plot failed, Kluge was immediately drawn into the ensuing investigation. Summoned to Berlin to account for his actions and loyalties, Kluge understood the inevitable outcome: trial, disgrace, and execution. He chose to swallow poison en route to Berlin, leaving behind a letter that was both loyal to the German people and deeply critical of Hitler's leadership. The deaths of Rommel and Kluge, two of the Wehrmacht's most respected field marshals, had a chilling, paralyzing effect on the entire officer corps. It confirmed that there was no safe middle ground. Any doubt, any hesitation, and certainly any attempt to broker peace was considered high treason by the regime. The surviving generals learned the lesson well. Whatever illusions of internal reform or military salvation remained were extinguished. They were now trapped, forced to continue fighting a war they knew was hopeless, or face immediate death at the hands of their own government. The failed assassination attempt against Adolf Hitler on July 20th, 1944, orchestrated by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg and the Corps of the Military Resistance, proved to be one of the most fateful moments of the war. Its failure created a chilling effect that completely paralyzed the surviving officer corps, extinguishing the last remnants of hope for internal military salvation and confirming the ultimate destructive power of the Nazi state. The plot, while driven by the military necessity of ending the lost war, ultimately failed due to a complex series of mishaps and terrible luck. The heavy conference table protecting Hitler from a bomb blast and the conspirators' paralyzing hesitation in Berlin. The immediate consequences were devastating. Hitler, surviving the blast, emerged consumed by a paranoid and vengeful fury. The resulting Gestapo purge tore through the ranks of the Wehrmacht and the Abwehr military intelligence, targeting not only those directly involved, but also anyone suspected of disloyalty, past descent, or even indirect association with conspirators. Thousands of individuals, including dozens of high-ranking officers, were arrested. Many were subjected to show trials by the People's Court, presided over by the fanatical Judge Roland Freisler, and brutally executed. Generals like Erwin von Witzleben and Erich Hoppner were degraded, stripped of their honor, and hanged. The sheer brutality of the executions, often filmed for Hitler's viewing pleasure, sent a clear, terrifying message. Dissent meant not just death, but the complete destruction of one's reputation and family honor. The chilling effect was absolute. Any general who had quietly harbored doubts, who had considered joining the resistance, or who had simply discussed the possibility of a political settlement, instantly retreated into the deepest possible shell of silent compliance. The failure of the plot solidified the regime's control over the military, forcing the surviving generals to understand that the regime would drag them and the entire nation down into the abyss with it. There was no longer any moral or military escape hatch. The only choice was silent, hopeless obedience, or immediate, agonizing death. After July 20th, the war was carried forward entirely by inertia and terror. The professional generals understood that the decision to fight was no longer based on military logic, but on Hitler's destructive will and the SS' iron grip on the state. They continued to command units, falsify reports, and execute suicidal holding actions, but they did so with complete, fatalistic certainty that their efforts were entirely futile and merely prolonged the slaughter. The failure of the July plot was not just the end of a conspiracy. It was a psychological surrender of the German officer corps to the inevitable. By early 1945, the grim certainty known by the generals was unfolding into a rapid, terrifying collapse on all fronts. The physical destruction of Germany and the psychological destruction of the Wehrmacht were now simultaneous. The Red Army was inexorably advancing through East Prussia and Silesia, while the Western Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine and flood into the German heartland. The nation lay in ruins, and yet, in the underground bunkers of Berlin, Hitler continued to issue impossible, suicidal orders. The orders that filtered out from the Führer's bunker were completely divorced from military reality. Cities were to be held to the last man. Counterattacks were to be launched by armies that no longer existed, and the last remnants of the civilian population were to be conscripted into the barely trained Volkssturm, People's Storm. This period marked the final, decisive disintegration of discipline and the final abandonment of professional duty by many generals. The years of suppressing doubt finally culminated in quiet, passive resistance. Many generals, simply stopped obeying the destructive orders. They falsified reports to show that units had already been destroyed, ignored direct commands to hold cities to the death, and quietly began surrendering their commands to the Western Allies rather than sacrificing their remaining men in futile last stands against the Soviets. This disobedience was not a grand act of defiance, but a quiet, pragmatic realization that adherence to the Führer's orders would only hasten the destruction of the men they commanded. The few generals who remained fiercely loyal, men like Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, were often seen as tragic, delusional figures by their peers, clinging to the fantasy that the Western Allies might turn against the Soviets and join Germany in a final anti-Bolshevik crusade. But even these hopes were delusions born of ultimate desperation. The entire system of military obedience, once the unbreakable foundation of the Wehrmacht, had dissolved into a mix of cynicism, despair, and individual survival strategies. In April 1945, as the Soviets closed in on Berlin, Hitler finally acknowledged what his generals had known for years. In a dramatic meeting in the Führer bunker on April 22nd, he suffered a complete mental breakdown, raging against his generals and accusing them of betrayal and cowardice. Yet, amidst the rage, he finally admitted that the war was lost and that suicide was his only escape. For the generals, this moment brought no relief, only the confirmation that their years of sacrifice, silence, and professional duty had ended in the ultimate ruin of their nation and their own honor. The story of Hitler's generals is not the story of a single climactic defeat, but the chronicle of slow, agonizing psychological surrender that preceded the military capitulation by years. They were men of immense intelligence and professional skill who possessed the unique clarity to read the maps, calculate the losses, and know, long before the bombs fell on Dresden or the Soviets entered Berlin, that the war could not be won. The great tragedy of the Wehrmacht was not just that it was defeated, but that it kept fighting long after it knew it was beaten. The initial arrogance of 1941, when they mistook the speed of the Blitzkrieg for true invulnerability, proved to be the original sin. The subsequent failures, the logistical collapse outside Moscow, the annihilation of Stalingrad, and the strategic failure at Kursk, systematically stripped away their illusions, leaving them with nothing but the grim certainty of destruction. They were trapped by their own historical tradition of obedience, by the terrifying shadow of the Gestapo, and by the sheer magnitude of the political and military machine they had helped to create. Their failure to act decisively upon their knowledge, the failure of the July 20th plot, sealed the fate of the German nation, ensuring that the final year of the war became an exercise in utter futility, a needless slaughter driven by inertia and terror. The ultimate defeat was a foregone conclusion written in the vastness of the Russian plains and the devastating statistics of production charts. When the guns finally fell silent, the generals were left with the bitter knowledge that their silence had prolonged the catastrophe. Their story serves as a profound historical lesson about the perilous intersection of professional duty and moral conscience. It reminds us that knowledge is not always power, and that the greatest tragedy is to foresee disaster and lack the moral courage to prevent it. We must look at this history not as a mere account of military maneuvers, but as a chilling study in professional paralysis under tyranny. The memoirs, the interrogation records, and the military archives continue to hold profound details about the personal struggles of these men. What would you have done if you were trapped in the high command, knowing the end was inevitable? What is the ethical line between duty and disaster? The conversation surrounding the true collapse of the Wehrmacht is far from over. Join the discussion in the comments below. Subscribe to continue exploring the hidden histories of the Second World War, and share this film to keep the lessons of this tragic period from being lost to time. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the military war ended, but the reckoning for Hitler's generals had only just begun. In Allied interrogation rooms and in the composition of post-war memoirs, these men faced a daunting task of explaining their actions, or more often, their inactions, during the final, destructive years of the regime. Their narrative was a carefully crafted blend of truth and self-serving evasion. Many generals instantly blamed Hitler, the SS, and the party, portraying themselves as non-political, professional soldiers who were victims of a mad dictator they could not control. They insisted they had seen the disaster coming, citing the initial logistical failures of Barbarossa and the catastrophic orders at Stalingrad as proof that they had tried to avert the ruin. There was undoubtedly truth in these claims. Many generals did oppose Hitler's strategic decisions and did see the inevitable defeat. However, there was also profound evasion. Most of those who later insisted they knew it was lost had continued to issue orders that prolonged the slaughter for months, even years, after the strategic outcome was certain. They had rationalized their complicity as duty, the unwavering loyalty to the oath they had taken. This rationalization allowed them to maintain their personal honor while overseeing the destruction of millions of lives. The professional adherence to the military hierarchy, the fear of the Gestapo, and the ingrained habit of obedience proved stronger than their moral courage to stage a mass defiance. The generals who were tried at Nuremberg, such as Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, remained stubbornly loyal to the end, signing the final unconditional surrender that marked the ultimate humiliation of the regime. In their final testimonies and in the narratives of the surviving officers, the tragedy of the Wehrmacht was laid bare, a professional, highly competent military institution that lacked the moral framework to resist an ideologically corrupt leader. They had prioritized military obedience and the preservation of the institution over the salvation of a nation. The post-war reckoning exposed a tragic psychological and moral flaw: the lack of will to stop a disaster they all could professionally foresee.